Well, welcome everybody to Future Ancestral Monuments. This is one of three programs as part of Shaping the Past. This series of programs is called Yaangna Beyond LA Indigenous Perspectives. It's one way that this partnership between Monument Lab, the Goethe-Institut, and the German Office for Civic Education has come together to support a, a 2 year project regarding civic memory, monuments, and the overlapping of that with public space. And today we're here at Grand Park. Grand Park has been, in its most recent years, pretty significant because one, it got redeveloped. That redevelopment was finalized in 2012, and it's been billed as the park for everybody. So the programming behind it, the intention is that this space is open for everybody to come and enjoy and use the park. The way I've been more associated with the park has been through my former position at Self Help Graphics as co-director there. And for about 6 years, I helped curate the Noche de Ofrenda, which is a community altar night, one of the many programs for Day of the Dead around that time. So just imagine, in this park, we would install over 40 altars, many of which spoke to different social issues, whether it was migration. The one that I really enjoyed the most was the one that was dedicated to all the adopted dogs and cats. So every year, this woman from the Orange County Animal Society would come and build an altar to all the dogs that passed that year. That came through her adoption agency or the agency that she worked. I thought that was really, really beautiful. The other one was a kindergarten class who did an altar for all the extinct animals in Southern California. And the one I remember the most was the mega shark, or that there was this huge shark that was found in Los Angeles, like the fossilized bones. And so in a small little elementary school in Boyle Heights, they reconstructed this mega shark out of cardboard. So they repurposed all these materials and did this big old altar at their school, and then they had an altar here with a bunch of other animals. So this space, in a way, has done some of that work. I have to credit Julia Diamond, the director here, for doing that. But as we create these spaces to gather and commune and learn and just build community, there was always this one thing that just kind of, was just an obstacle. And to my right stood the Columbus statue. It's gone now. And then to my left was a George Washington statue, which is also gone now. And it was this reminder of many things that have to, that we have to reckon with, right? Not just Columbus. Columbus becomes a symbol of all that, of the narrative of the U.S. and its establishment and the colonization that's taken place on this continent. And there's so much history here connected to this park that we don't get to talk about because that becomes the narrative. And as we were replacing as a city Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day, I remember walking through this park and I remember all the altars we installed. But most importantly, I remember when I was a teenager catching the bus across the street from here to go to work, always running into that statue and being like, man, like this doesn't belong here. And feeling at that point, kind of as a young person, really disempowered. And I grew up in the punk rock scene, so much of what I learned there really also drives the work that I do now. Like this democratizing of information, like making zines to get the information out, making zines to help people learn about certain things. And this has been like my connection to this park. But, we call it Grand Park, we call it Grand Park LA, but in a sense, this is Yaangna. This is Yaangna, not in a sense, this is Yaangna. And for folks who don't know, I'm gonna introduce Cindi here, a relative that I've known for a while, someone who I very fortunate enough to learn from and work with, and in more recent years kind of also co-conspire with, right? And talk about these ideas that we want to do and figure out how we're gonna make them happen. And then Lupe, who I've known for a while too, we grew up in the same time period in the 90s, one of the most violent period in LA's history. And I used to say the most violent period in LA's history, but then I remember like if I tell that story, I say it through that perspective, then I'm ignoring what happened here before the founding of the city and all that violence that occurred before that. So now I say one of the most violent because there's several periods. But Cindi, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself and then Yaangna. What is Yaangna back then, today, and into the future?
Meha, I'm Cindi Alvitre. I'm affiliated with the Gabrielino Tongva tribe, and my community is Tiat Society, the Maritime Community, and Traditional Council Pimu. And it's good to be here because I'm sitting here listening to Joel talk and feeling the land, but also very, very aware of what was here, and what continues to be here because it's still in the soil, it's still in the air, it's there, and Yaangna, just to give you a little bit of history, we go back to 1769, Spanish colonization. Father Sarah, whose statue was gratefully pulled down, leads a group of soldiers to what was Alta California. And by 1771, they end up in Los Angeles. All the different tribes and the Tongva, let me just explain this too, because we use that term. The name that the Spaniards gave to us was Gabrielino, which is affiliated with San Gabriel Mission. So like Gabrielino, San Gabriel Mission, San Juan Capistrano, Juaneños. And so as a result of that missionization, people were no longer in their respective villages, because that's how you identified. There is 100+ villages throughout Los Angeles County and extend all the way down into San Diego with those tribes, the Ahachmim, the Kumeyaay, the Luceños, the Quillas, the Tataviam, the Chumash, all of them. Everybody felt it. What ends up happening here, and I always refer to the people here as first contact tribes, because we have to remember we're very close to the Pacific Ocean. We're within really walking distance by old standards, right? And there was only a couple ways to transport yourself to get around in that days, and it was the ocean or it was walking. And so, as first contact tribes, we were the tribes that took those initial blows. Los Angeles Harbor is considered to be significant economically, geographically, as a port where people could actually bring your ships in. As a result of this, Los Angeles, the Pueblo, is founded here. Now, Yaangna as a village existed before the mission period. Once a mission was established, it continued to exist right out of the Pueblito, right out of where the center of Los Angeles, where Olvera Street is. And then they're viable to some degree until like 1830, things begin to change, Mexican secularization, and it becomes this period of economic devastation. That's when things changed drastically. It became a refugee camp. Yaangna also was surrounded by other villages, or the people from Catalina Island, from San Nicolas Island, the Southern Channel Islands, when they were relocated off of those islands, they came into these villages here. They brought them to the mainland. So the people here attempted to live a traditional lifestyle, but their practices, their spirit, their ways collided with the settlers. And as more and more American immigrants start coming in early, just 1830 to like 1847 is when it becomes the most devastating, where they are no longer treated as even subhumans, but they are treated as slaves. They are treated as the people who are the wild Indians, the ones that did not go into the mission and did not become the neophytes. By 1850s, you have American settlers coming in, you have ranchos, the land really begins to change. And Yaangna, and just where we're at, and I'll talk about it a little bit more, just trying to give you a little bit of an orientation where we're at. Right across, when I'm looking directly beyond Grand Park, where the federal courthouse is, that's where the Downey complex, it was actually the place where the people, my ancestors, where they were auctioned off as slaves. Those that, as laborers, became indentured slaves to those people who started the viticulture, the wine, the wineries, and the ranches. And it just turns into this very, very sad story. 1847, the last remnants of Yaangna is burned down because they were fearful of the people continuing to gather, washing their clothes, taking the water from the Zangha, the LA River. That was the only source of water. 26 villages were lined along that river since the beginning of time. So Yaangna is here, it's present. The wind's blowing, it's acknowledging and saying, yeah, Yaangna's still here.
Thank you, Cindi. And Lupe, this idea of holding on to our experiences, our stories, this is something that you, through social media, through technology, have been able to become, I say, like a steward of, a caretaker of these histories. And much of that has to do with youth culture, with the party scene that you and I experienced, you know, also the criminalization of our generation, right? We had Prop 187, I was at Prop 21, the Three Strikes Law, and all kind of things that affect the youth around that time. And for me, like, it was really, really a point of getting radicalized, of learning how to organize, of, you know, grabbing onto the power that youth have. So you've been able to kind of bring that to the attention of many folks across the world who wouldn't know what, you know, who Aztec Nation was, or who, you know, many of these like party crews that existed back then. You know, there's also like a lot of tragedy associated with that because of just the trauma that our communities have experienced. And in that, I think there's a lot of beauty that's also come from folks honoring their cousin, their brother, their sister who passed on in the form of these murals that pop up all over the city. And also these candlelight vigils that, you know, get installed very, you know, hesitantly, but then remain for years and years on end. Like there's one by my house that's been there for like a good 10 years. And somebody always has the care to go back, put more candles, make sure that every night it's lit. And then it becomes a practice that the community also takes ownership over, right? Not just the immediate family. And much of that is reflected in your work. Can you speak to that a little bit and why you chose that format? But also like how you, even though you're the one who manages the site, you're also the one who allows that democracy of memory to take shape.
Yeah. So these two projects that I have on Instagram, two digital archives, pretty much started like it was more about wanting to have like a shared experience with people, specifically women. And then because that was happening, then it started opening up all these other conversations, you know, like about grief, about celebration, about even from my own personal experience, about shame, even growing up, you know, in East LA. But, you know, the root of that was also still grieving my cousin who had been murdered in 96. And something about that death made me feel like I know I'm not alone in that, you know, because I also grew up in a neighborhood that there was like drive-by shootings in my house, like in front of my house, pretty much like every weekend. And it became this normalized thing, you know, like we were numb to it. But when I started the two platforms, I wasn't, you know, I was actually living on the East Coast. And when I was away from my own community, I was able to reflect back and to look back at my own experience on that. And there was also like this longing of wanting to have these conversations, but I also knew that they were really difficult. So I was really, you know, I talked to a friend about this, like, almost like, it felt like this urgency that needed to happen. And I started this you know, Veteranas and Rucas on Instagram because I knew that it was like, okay, it's people are on their phones already. It's gonna reach people worldwide even. I mean, this is like something that I didn't know. I was thinking I'm in the East Coast. I want to connect with people in LA or Southern California. And the projects just grew within a month, and it was reaching people worldwide, and these conversations almost started, even if people didn't grow up in East LA or Southern California, it was almost like people started making connections. And the reason why I wanted to focus on youth culture specifically was because I noticed that as adults we still couldn't talk about it. Like it was like this type of thing. It's like, well, we don't talk about it because what we did back in the day was wrong. Even if we were just socializing, even if it was like a group of kids walking down the street, and we got arrested, it was our fault. So I wanted to really question that, because I also knew that even from my own experience going, like even in school, for a while I felt bad because I didn't graduate from high school, and I was like really private about that. But then the work really encouraged me to start talking about that, even for myself. And I started meeting and having these conversations with other people who had similar experiences. So for me, it's really important to have these, like, I guess this idea of storytelling to like dismantle the depictions that we've had in the past, and that's happening every day. It's community based, because people are sharing their personal stories, and it's really like as true as possible. Yeah. So then, in terms of like bringing it back to the physical, you know, something interesting that happened a few years ago. I had an exhibition in New York, and I had an altar for my cousin, but it was almost like this an invitation for others to leave materials or objects to pretty much like celebrate their past loved ones. And when that show closed, it traveled to Philly, and then those materials also traveled to Philly, and then it just kept going back to LA. And then when the exhibition was finally shipped back home, I came back with all these like letters and just materials about like pretty much people still grieving or acknowledging those loved ones.
And so you mentioned storytelling, which, for indigenous folks, like oral history is like super important. And although like monuments here get put up to impose an ideology on us, etc., like we find ways of either through gossip, chisme, or we find a way to communicate these stories. And YouTube and Google at various points have done studies as to like who uses like apps the most. And it always turns out that Spanish-speaking communities are the number one users of apps and phones, right? And you think about like how many Obama phones have been given out in East LA, because, I get texts from folks who I've like lost contact with. I got a text from somebody in jail saying, I saw your interview on ABC7 when you took down the Sarah statue. I haven't heard from him in 15 years. And he found a way to like get a phone and send me a text. And so that's the power of like sometimes using technology to uplift our own stories. And Cindi, you recently released a book that touches on the creation story of your peoples. But beyond that, you've also created a VR experience, which will be launched in the coming months here at Grant Park. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, thanks, Joel. Yes, we just released a book. Was a collaboration with a young woman, an illustrator who's one of my students at Cal State Long Beach, Carly Lake. And this is a story that was born a long time ago. It's a story, the name of the book is Wa'aka, the bird who fell in love with the sun. And the core part of it is actually the story of how the sun was born and how the sun got put up into the sky. because and there's many sites where this story is narrated visually. In Riverside County, the land of the Quillas and the Luceños, there's a rock shelter out there, rock art site, and this story is still told. So being able to take that and find different venues, different mediums to be able to tell these stories in the present is really important to keep them alive. The memory is there. The visual memory, those become like a mnemonic device, to remind us, the images, the painted images, and your red ochre and your white, white ochre, all these pigments that just very simple that actually remind us. It's a symbol and it reminds us. But how do you bring that into the present so that not only our young people have the opportunity to share that story and to be able to let it live within them for future generations? So it tells that story, but the other part of it is actually the story. Part of it was my own experiences in living in Catalina Island and just reciprocating and having these relationships with the nature over there. And there was a bird, and the bird, I followed it. It was barking at night. I said, "What bird barks?" And so I followed this bird down the beach and onto the green pier and watched where all the Boston whalers and all the little skiffs. And there was this bird, and his neck was kind of jutted forward. He had a black streak, and he barked. I'm like, what's this all about? So in my mind, I came up with this whole story, but it was really a connection. It's really trying to teach our young people how to have those relationships, but also what is our responsibility? What is our responsibility? Creation stories are like time traveling. There are these vessels where we go back to that part of creation, that very first part. It's like when we do ceremony, we go back to tell the creation story, because it puts us at that purity time where we can start over and over and over again. We can reboot over and over again, because that's the way we heal. That's the way we move forward in this colonial environment that's just pounding us every day. It's wave after wave after wave. So how do you do that? You have to stir the imagination of our people, because that's what it is. It's about telling stories. It's allowing them to have the relationship with the black-crowned night heron and talk to him. He barks, you talk. He barks, you talk. You tell each other stories. And so that's one creation story, but the other one is one that's very significant, and it's a story of our premier village of Puvungna. That's where we emerged as human beings, where the spiritual philosophy of most Southern California Indians emerged from that site. And to be able to tell that story, once again, it's not just, I guess our fears in this time is people always want to reduce holy stories to like the stuff of kindergarten. Once upon a time there was Little Red Riding Hood, and she had a picnic basket, and there was no tortillas in there, so it wasn't true. But how do you convey these stories? This is our prayer. So people don't understand. Stories are not just stories. It's how we remember. It's how we remember. It's how we connect. So fast forward, how do you put those into a language? Because we have textual literacy everywhere, right? Cultural literacy is another part. But how do we put it into a language that all people can participate in? Because honestly, as Indigenous people of the land, if we're not sharing what we have and allowing people to come in and connect with this land right here, I don't know what we're doing, especially at this time. It's so important right now that all people connect, because the most powerful thing that we have is the earth and the air and the water and the sun and each other. So being able to do the VR, virtual reality, that's kind of trippy anyway, right? Because it's like it can become your own religion once you go into that, and allowing people to go in and to be able to narrate. So what we did was, it was actually one of my bosses who's the chair of anthropology and the student. So there's a genuine collaboration going on there. And we came together where I narrated the story of Puvungna, and Carly Lake she did the artwork in a program called Tilt Brush, and she illustrated the whole story. So it's what we do in the present. We have to move forward and understand the world is not this topographical political map. We live in dimensional space. We live in a dimensional world. And there's our stories become the liminal space. It's the between and the betwixt that we allow people to go into that space. But only certain people have the knowledge and the responsibility to guide people into that space. It's the only way. Virtual reality is probably kind of a good way. Here's this space, here's that space, here's the water, here's the air. When you come up from the pool, that blip, right? That's a liminal space. And we can all go there.
The funny thing, there's this series on Hulu titled Rami, and in that he has two cousins, and they're just hilarious. But it's such a parallel to Chicanismo, like what they're experiencing. So I recommend folks to watch it. But his two cousins, while they're all doing some shenanigans, put on these VR lenses and visit the Holy Land. And they're praying, and it's just like, it's after a night of like some crazy stuff. But that VR technology allows them to, in many ways, connect to their homeland because they can't. And I have this here given to me by one of my friends who's Armenian. Some folks who were with us when the Sarah statue came down, right? You talk about this period for us, all of us, to come together and move forward collectively. So I brought it today just to honor what's going on over there and to uplift like the interconnectedness between the many indigenous groups all over the world, right? We're all indigenous to some place. But two things that I want to touch on. One, you mentioned the word vessel. And the other, you mentioned like we all get to participate in this. And when you say vessel, I think about the Tiats. You're a member of the Tiat Society. And, for me, this idea of a Tiat in relationship to monuments is very parallel as well. Like we sit in front of City Hall, this building that in many ways teaches us to act accordingly as citizens of this city and this country, right? Mm-hmm. Or else. There's that always, or else, right? And the Tiat and the practice of maintaining a Tiat carries traditions, carries teachings, carries values. And in many ways it does what a monument should do in I would say in a humane way, without the or else. Can you talk a little bit about the Tiat Society?
Sure.
And the canoes?
Yeah, the canoes. Tiat, sewn plank canoe, the only method of transportation in pre-contact times for thousands of years, made out of the planks from trees that washed down the coast of Los Angeles coast from Northern California, well seasoned, saturated with that water. That's all the memory of all people coming down to plank that out, sew them together, no metal in them. And these boats, as part of the colonization with the missions, that was your vessel to connect to your relatives on the island, to the mainland, to other people. That was your telephone. That was your media. That's the way you communicated. And of course, the Spanish cut it off. That tradition didn't exist for a couple hundred years. And here's the strength of memory. Because what does John Trudell say? That our DNA is earth and sky. Our memory, and I believe that Lupe said it, that caretaker of memory. Did I get that right? That's, yeah, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But how does this come to us? And the whole beginning of the Tiat is based, that's my tattoo is the story of that. In the center is an abalone fishhook, and on the side you see two mountains. So when I was a young mother on welfare, single mom, 4 kids, and didn't know where to go, what to do, and I had this dream of my kids were in the backyard and they're playing with these, I hear them and I go in the backyard and they're playing with these big huge balls of lava, tossing them to each other, just laughing, and I'm like, you're tired, go back and go to sleep. So I go back into my bed And then I wake up in my dream again. And when I wake up this time, they're still playing with this lava, but in front of them is the Santa Ana Mountains, Saddleback. In the center of Saddleback was the head of this warrior. His hair was all pulled up, black, thick, greasy, with a big hair stick in it. His eyes were closed, and right here was where all this lava was pouring out, and the kids were like, they were receiving it like jewels. But in the front, there is water. And in this water were these boats. I'm not familiar with these boats, but everybody was getting into them, and I'm saying, Pukushe, Pukushe, everybody paddle, sing at once. And when we all did, the mountains opened, the warrior opened his eyes, the lava stopped, and we're all paddling to Catalina Island. Like, dang, you tired, girl. Vision, dream, memory, what is it? Spirit talking? And I let it go, and 2 weeks later this man calls and he says, hey, my name is Jim Noyes, and I have Indigenous Watercraft Association, and would you like to build one of these boats? We'll finance it. And that's how Momatahiko, Momat, ocean, Ahiko, or Ahikan, breath, wind, was born. And she became, when we're talking about monuments, she became the central icon, if you want to put it that, to the people. There's not anybody in our very complicated community, all the different ones who argue and, you know, and everything else, but when it comes to Momatahiko, they all love her because she's a vessel. She's that in between. She's that between and betwixt. When we're in her on the ocean, she's allowing us to participate and have that relationship with the water and all the ancestors that live underneath there. The rocks and the dolphins, the mammals, but also the unseen and the seen. She also allows us to be that vessel to connect to the sky. So it's like a map. She becomes like a map, and we're in the center of our world. So it's, you know, and let me just say this too, because I've been thinking about this too, you know, how one small little monument, or we're looking at the big city hall right in front of us, they make them bigger and bigger, right? Monuments in the Western European paradigm, they're bigger and bigger and bigger, and monoliths are really tall. But our monuments, they travel, they move. You know, it's kind of like, what's this philosopher? Pierre Nora, he was a French philosopher, and he used the term lieu de mémoire, sites of memory. But this is after you have milieu de mémoire, which are environments of memory. So as Indigenous people, they've attempted to take and reduce and destroy those environments of memory. It was all saturated. Reduce us to the sites of memory. But what's happening now is we're reversing. Because as the environment becomes sad as memory and we acknowledge it, it becomes alive. It takes its life again, but all people feel it. Everybody feels it.
Beautiful. And yeah, beautiful. And so this idea of caretaking of those stories, of those memories, Lupe, it just, I still can't understand. I mean, I can grasp how the work that you're doing, even though you might not even like take credit for it, has opened up this conversation around reframing what juvenile justice looks like, with these concepts of restorative justice, transformative justice, and also like our own indigenous-based ways of dealing with conflict, right? We have all these ceremonies that can help folks navigate these things, right? We have coming of age ceremonies. And in many ways, a lot of the work that you do uplifts some of that, whether it came from tragedy, whether it was youth escaping school or escaping indoctrination to go find themselves, right? This idea that everybody gets to participate in making memory. How does that, like, you know, how do you, because you and I have had many conversations on this, but how do you like reconcile with the fact that you're this, or the work that you've done has become this nexus of activity in relationship to how folks are now reconciling with their old past?
You know, I was actually thinking about a friend of mine who had been killed by the police in '98, and this is a kid who sat in front of me in high school, because we had like, I think his last name was also under R. So every year almost, he sat right in front of me. And I remember him as this like timid, just really like reserved kid. And when I was living in New York, I found out he had been killed. When I read the article, it was gang member shooting at the police, and the police shot him because he had a gun. And which to me was like didn't really make sense, you know, because I was someone that I somewhat knew, and
Ghetto bird.
yeah.
It is a ghetto bird.
Yeah. And anyway, so a few months ago, I posted a photo of him, and I talked about my experience, like just like how I knew him. You know, this is Anthony, who I went to school with, who had been shot by the police, and I saw like then there were a bunch of comments from people that knew him and didn't know him, you know, and there was a comment by someone, and they said, no, the cops shot him because he had a shotgun, and he was shooting. He's not a good guy. Like, what are you talking about? And then she commented saying again, like, you know, another comment. She's like, I know this because I read it in the LA Times, which made me think like, okay, well then who's like you're gonna rely on the LA Times to tell our story, you know? Like, who gets to say that? And then someone else who was a friend. Should I stop while the helicopter?
Yeah. I guess the helicopter's landing on top of some building over there.
Speaking of ghetto birds. And then I guess his friend commented and said, no, actually, I was there. He and I had been, we went and got food, and he was holding a burrito. And that is what happens on this platform, you know? Like, we are able to say the truth, you know? But at the same time, it's like what you were saying, like, we're all having a different experience right now, even. That's just going to be the soundtrack for today, the ghetto bird.
That was the weirdest thing I've ever seen. I've never seen it land on top of that like other part of City Hall and then just take off again.
I know. So, I forgot your question, but I think...
obviously you have some sort of, or you feel some sort of responsibility to that work. So that is a big responsibility. And I've seen you at times that kind of go in and set a tone of like, we're not going to deal with any shaming of women. We're not going to, we're not going to tolerate anybody coming in and saying, just like what you said right now, like this person was a bad person. Why are we even giving them a platform to share their experience? So there's a lot of work that goes behind that and to create space for everybody to participate, even when the folks chiming in on our opposite sides of that same incident. Like, I think, for example, there was one time where, somebody had got killed, and both sides of like that person or that incident, right? The folks who were related to the person who got killed and the person who was related to the one who supposedly did the killing were chiming in. And at the end of it, they were kind of like, wait a minute, like we're all suffering from the same thing and we're all just trying to tell our story. And I think that's a beautiful part of what you've created, in that it's not within the space of like this institution of like, this is how people who behave this way are valid or there's value to. It's just like, no, like we're all shedding trauma. We're all shedding these horrific actions that we've had to survive through. And now we're just trying to come together to tell our story. And so when you both say like, we all get to participate in that, I think at this point, people try and say like, well, we removed the Columbus statue. What figure are we going to put there? And it sounds like we're all saying like, well, we don't want that. Like, there's more to our values beyond the erection of a human figure, which usually ends up being a dude, right? This dude who did
Yeah.
something. So, thinking into the future, right now that we have the opportunity to like just reframe monuments, memory, etc. Like for you, for both of you, what does that look like? Like, what big ideas do you have? Where do you want to take your work?
I mean, like you said earlier, we've been doing this, you know? Like, we've been putting our altars, we've been, like, acknowledging someone's death in this way. But also, something that we talked about in our first meeting was that, you know, I think about like the energetic that's still here, and I'm really interested in acknowledging that as well, you know. And then I gave this example of someone, you know, like I had passed by Soto and Cesar Chavez, and someone had been shot the night before, and just I remember just walking by this family, and there was something that I was able to relate, you know, like I just felt like when I passed that family, I don't know, I just felt something really strong, and I feel like in that way we could be more like sensitive to that, you know, like anyway. So that experience was really powerful for me because I was able to stop and spend time with the family, and be there and say it. I get you. I feel this. I have the same. I've been here before. Also, in terms of like these altars, they don't necessarily have to be. From my experience of what I believe in is that I don't know if we need to paint a mural. You know what I mean? But I know that like us as humans, we do map the city from experience. Even like my cousin being killed in a playground. You know, like I see that playground as his life is still there because he shed some blood there, and maybe LA is that's what LA is for me. So yeah, I don't know if we actually need like we need monuments. In other words,
We need healing, sounds like.
exactly.
Right?
Yeah, I would agree with that too. I was thinking that too. Exactly the same thing you're saying, Lupe, is why do we need these singular kind of iconic monuments? It's not even a memorial to that is really promoting more pain. You know, why is it always about human beings that we're always trying to glorify human beings and not the site of where things have happened? I mean, when you're talking about places of healing, it's important, and maybe it's because it's just this time right now on our planet that if we're all going to participate in the same healing, that we need to find something that gives us life and gives us healing. I mean, like here I'm listening to the water in the fountain, and I know that we're all related by that water. You know, if we're going to have something, if they said, Cindi, what do you want today? I'd say, I want the presence of water here. I want a place where people can come back to their center, find their center here, and renegotiate their relationship with the land, but also with each other. But until we heal, we have difficulty relating to each other because there's this fear. There's this fear that's just building up, this monolithic fear. And people can't let go of it because they don't know how to let go of it. They don't know where to release it. So how do we do that? And we go back to Indigenous people, and it becomes so simple it's complicated, the old adage, right? But we don't need any more monuments. I completely agree with that. We need places where people can go to heal.
For sure.
Let's appreciate. Let's know this whole park. Let's know I'm here, and I know that there's homeless people. I know this has been a site of a lot of activism. I know there's lots of things here. You know, the village sites of Yaangna, they're all converging, all that energy, and people feel it. You know, what people call mental illness, or maybe even what they've deemed as schizophrenia. What is it? When we come down to being human beings, are we that simplistic that we just ignore this? Or are we really trying to reactivate that sixth sense, that seventh sense, that eighth sense that we've lost? And who's going to teach them how to do that? Who helps to visualize that? A lot of times it's the artist. It's the medicine people are artists. They're the creative spirits. They tried to kill everything else. They just couldn't kill the creative spirit. It's still alive. Let's show it to everybody.
And so you and I have talked about trees, and this is where like this idea of like trees and nature as monument, I think for me, comes from. And you talk a lot about oak trees and the ecosystem that they create, right? Like many trees just stand there and give us shade and do a lot of other good stuff. But oak trees and you know other trees similar to that, like they actually create a whole ecosystem of support. And I use that as a symbolism of everything you just talked about, of having places to gather without the police. Like over here, there was a security guard looking at us for a while. I think they left, even though we have permission to be here, to have a security guard looking at us. But this idea of having this canopy of care for our people. Tell us more about what you envision. You know, you were talking about 100 ancestor poles the other day.
Yeah.
You know, I know you have a lot of big ideas of what needs to happen in this city to bring that healing, to initiate that healing.
Yeah, and you know, when it comes to the trees, as you said, it's life. I mean, a tree takes sometimes 100, 200 years to grow, and then we vacantly chop it down and cut it up and use it as a chair that's going to be thrown away in 5 years because we're bored with it. That's somebody's life. That's kind of what I'm talking about, is how do you renew those relationships with those ancestors, with the Amupavitam, those pre-human ancestors who give their life for us all the time. And that's where you have to put those reminders. I mean, when I'm saying I see art, like I talk about the ancestor poles. Let me give that as an example. That's probably the best example I can give. In the old way, when somebody passed away, they would do kotumut, is what it was called, but you would have a pole that was harvested from a tree who gives its life to honor this individual who has passed, and that pole would be put up, and after a year they would dress the pole like the person, they would put all the offerings, and they would burn that pole. The pole would disappear. It would be gone, because that's what you did. The whole any physical elements of a person's life were done. Today we make ancestor poles. At Cal State Long Beach at Puvungna, we have an ancestor pole. At the Farm Lab at the Metabolic Studio, we did ancestor poles there. It was a place for us to gather, because sometimes we need to know that there's something that we can come to a center to gather. You know, not everybody sees the world as we do. Not everybody has is it a maturity, a cultural, a spiritual maturity? I don't know. But that's the power of having a pole, you know, like a 20-foot pole that's carved out of a tree that has the sacred colors, the white, the color of purity, the very beginning of our time as the Gabrielino Tongva tribe, that's what our Creator was fed everybody, because that's all the food was white clay. Or when he died and his heart exploded because coyote went to bite into his heart, and the red that exploded through the world, and that's why red is a sacred, or the black ashes, red, white, and black. We have those on the pole to remind us to travel through birth, through death, through life. And that becomes a book. It becomes a narrative to teach people. So, you know, with ancestor poles, yes. It's a memory of all the people that have died. I mean, I want to do a project. I want to do an installation at Cal State Long Beach. I probably shouldn't even say this in the film, because then they're going to hear it and they're going to get all paranoid again. They've been paranoid of me for years. They don't know what I'm up to. But I want to see a field of ancestor poles. Visually, it's incredibly beautiful for all the families that would participate in mourning, in paying homage to their ancestors, to extending love, to visiting, and it's there on the sacred land. It's a beautiful act. You know, we just don't see those kind of, it's not a cemetery. So it's monument, but it's a center. It becomes a center.
Yeah, so I don't know, this Western way of thinking puts these monuments with this idea of permanence, right? If we put this here, that means that we're okay and everything's gonna remain status quo. And what we're hearing, or what I'm hearing, is the permanence of our memory is in the relationship building, in the convening with one another, in that interconnectivity between us, even if there's misunderstandings. But the power of walking together, right? Like the Zapatistas say, like, walking together, like nobody in front of one another, but everybody kind of, you know, equal. And unless, if we don't learn how to walk together, there it goes again.
Wow, that's twice in one day. Ghetto bird behind the center of City Hall.
Yeah, like the Zapatistas say, like if we don't learn to walk together, then all we're doing is creating conflict with one another. And I think in this point in time where we're at now, having these monuments like up block us from being able to have these conversations, from being able to have an opportunity to just sit down and understand one another. And since that thing's been gone, so much beauty has come from it, right? We wouldn't be here today talking about this had we not removed that. We wouldn't be talking about reclaiming parts of Olvera had we not removed the Sarah statue. So, lesson of the day, topple monuments, begin healing. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. It's been a beautiful conversation with Cindi, Alvitre, and Lupe Rosales. And we'll come back together again for civic displays with Julia Bogny and Pamela Villaseñor, moderated by Rostin Wu. Thank you.